Beautiful. Thank you, Father Declan. And I suppose, to wrap it up in a nutshell, the idea of this conference is to encourage you to basically take a journey in faith, with faith being the acronym of a fantastic adventure in trusting Him. So with that, I'm delighted then to introduce our first speaker, Jason Osborne. So Jason is a journalist with the Irish Catholic newspaper. Before that, he did a year of mission with Pure in Heart, having just recently come back to his faith. And he's going to be speaking about arguments in favor of Jesus Christ and his church, and share a little bit of how this impacted him on his journey in the faith. So Finding Faith with Jason Osborne. So Jason, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. Can everyone hear me okay?
Perfect.
Perfect. Thanks a million. So, I'm always a little embarrassed nearly when I'm asked to speak at these things, because I'm sure nearly everyone could do just as good a job. But before I begin, I really love the theme of the conference this weekend, and it really reminded me of a quote that I saw, Father Declan, when you were speaking about that exciting nature of the faith, because as we'll come to see, there's really no one more exciting than the person of Christ. And I saw a quote by G.K. Chesterton there just yesterday, and I think it sort of works well for sort of how we're going to be looking at Christ now in a moment. Chesterton said, the function of imagination is not to make strange things settled so much as to make settled things strange, not so much to make wonders facts as to make facts wonders. And the reason that's so interesting to me, particularly when we consider Christ, is because as Catholics, a lot of the time, I think we sort of take Christ for granted. We've been born into a world with 2,000 years of the church behind us. We take for granted the fact that Christ is God. But for people back then, and indeed people now who don't have anything to do with the church, it's anything but a given. So Sarah asked me to give the talk anyway, because she heard me give one a couple of years ago and seemed to think it was decent enough. So I will share my screen now. If I let me see. Yeah, there we go. I got it. Perfect. So here we go. Okay, so I hope everyone can see that. Let me know if there's any issues. So yeah, the topic of the talk is going to be finding faith. So to begin anyway, the foundation of our faith. I won't make it too complicated, because there's so many avenues you could go down with this. The entirety of the Catholic faith rests upon Jesus Christ. Sounds like an obvious thing to say, but as we'll get into, it really isn't. It's such a remarkable thing that we deal with day to day, and we take it for granted so much of the time. But yeah, the entirety of our faith rests upon Jesus Christ. If we find him, we find faith, we find adventure, we find that exciting life that you were talking about, Father. As St. Paul says in his first letter to the Corinthians, if for this life only we have hoped in Christ, we are of all men most to be pitied. Now, what he was talking about there was, if Christ isn't true, he was talking about if Christ hadn't been resurrected from the dead, or if Christ wasn't resurrected from the dead, if it was all a big hoax, if Christ wasn't, what we believe him to be, if he isn't what we believe him to be, the entirety of our faith collapses. There's nothing else for us to cling to. If Christ isn't who he says he is, we're most to be pitied, as St. Paul says. So it's absolutely essential that Jesus is who he says he is, first of all, but also that we're able to communicate that and we're able to defend that, and we don't just take it for granted because we were born into a family, say, that believed it, and because we live in a society that, well, up until recently took it for granted. So St. Paul believed, and so do we, obviously, that the entire faith hinges on Christ at the end of the day. So I thought an interesting thing maybe to start with these days is, what are the attitudes people have towards Christ? And I was watching a video in which people on the street, which is why I have that anonymous picture there, people on the street were interviewed, modern people on the streets of American cities. They were asked, who do you think Jesus is? Why is Jesus so famous? and I titled this slide with "Who do men say that the Son of Man is?" Because it's a question Jesus himself was interested in. He asks that in the Gospel according to Matthew. So these were some of the answers people gave in the video. The long-haired guy in the movies who had a hard time, the guy on the cross, a really forgiving person, a friend. One of the popular ones was a spiritual teacher, sort of similar to a wise man who wandered and taught. Someone said a purely historical figure, so presumably a pretty zealous Jew who stirred up rebellion, as we see here. Someone else said a rebel, and that's it. When he died, his movement carried on, but he didn't, to put it that way. Finally, yeah, you did get some people saying the Son of God, which is obviously what we as professed Catholics believe. So this is just a lot of the sort of the atmosphere that we're working in today. These are the West is a Christian civilization. It's built on the back of Christianity, and yet these are the answers that your average person gives on the street to who they think Jesus is. So it's good always to know what people think of Christ. So a couple of key questions we're going to address, because referring back to that Chesterton quote, the function of our imagination, but you could also say our intellect, is to really get to the heart of things. Stop taking things for granted. Stop taking settled things as settled. We really should stir these things up again, get to the bottom of, did Jesus really exist? Was he a liar, or was he mad? Was he or is he human? Was he or is he God? Why does he continue to come up? What did he do? What about the accounts of his resurrection? So as I say, and I'll sort of more so say towards the end of the talk why all of this impacted on me, because it's not my testimony. Ultimately, I want to give the talk first, but answering these questions is of the utmost importance, because it really does change lives depending on the answers that we give. So it's extremely important that we're able to give an account of ourselves. And of course, I won't be able to get into absolutely every aspect of these questions just in a brief talk, but we can at least do a surface level job, which is better than nothing. So first of all, we're going to go down the historical route. I said there, obviously, did Jesus really exist? So that's sort of where we're going to start, and then we'll get into the other things. And we'll start with historical evidence, because a lot of the time, again, dealing with the church, we sort of, after a point, you sort of stop worrying about evidence because you believe it anyway, which is good, obviously. But if someone asks you, you should be able to sum up, at least some of the historical evidence for what we believe about Christ. So did anyone write about Jesus, apart from the biblical authors? Because a lot of the time, if you say, well, the New Testament says, to someone who doesn't believe in the New Testament, they're going to say, oh, but of course you'd say that. So how do we know that the New Testament is reliable, or can we know at all? So before getting to that, yeah, some good people to give to people who are maybe a little skeptical of the biblical sources. Does secular evidence exist? So there's a couple of key places that Christ is mentioned, and some of these guys are, not questioned by historians today at all when it comes to other things. So they really shouldn't be questioned when it comes to them talking on Christ. So some of these, so Pliny the Younger was a Roman governor who, his mention of Christ comes from a letter to the emperor at the time. He what he did was he wrote a letter to the emperor asking for advice about how to deal with the Christians in the area, because they Christianity really was seen as a strange, bizarre sect. I mean, if you look at some of the charges brought against Christians from around that time, they were being charged with cannibalism because they were obviously engaging in the Eucharist, which was understood as eating the flesh of God, eating the flesh of a man at the same time. So cannibalism was often brought up against them. And Pliny the Younger was a Roman governor in the area at the time, and he was writing to the emperor asking for advice as to how to control the Christians. And there's reference to, at least it's popularly thought among scholars, that there's reference to Christ in the letter. They believe it's Christ as opposed to another Christian. So he's one. Tacitus and Suetonius were two Roman historians, both of whom make mention of Christians, but also again to Christ. And again, these guys are considered pretty foolproof when it comes to ancient history. So the fact that they make mention of Christ, at the very least, gives credence to the idea that Christ existed. Mara bar Serapion was a Stoic philosopher who wrote a letter to his son, sort of around the decade of AD 70. He wrote a letter to his son talking about essentially the price people pay for espousing wise teachings. He spoke about Socrates, and he also spoke about the wise king of the Jews who had been executed by the Jews. He was obviously referring to Jesus. So again, the whole point here is just that there is secular evidence for the existence of a physical historical character called Jesus. Because very often these days you do hear the, and I probably would have given it myself before I came back to the faith, this idea that Jesus doesn't even exist, he's a myth. I mean, it's a really uneducated opinion to hold. There's no serious historians don't believe Christ existed at all. The debate is over whether he was who he said he was. And then finally, Josephus was a Jewish historian who sort of commented extensively as well on Christianity and Christ at the time, and he's very reputable. So these are plenty of sources aside from Christian biblical sources that make mention of Christ, which is good enough reason for anyone who wants to look into it to believe that at the very least there was a historical concrete person, Jesus Christ. But in order to sort of prove his godhood, say, you do have to look at other sources. So that's secular evidence anyway. So we have textual criticism then, because as mentioned in that slide a couple of minutes ago, the New Testament is sort of our go-to for things about Christ's life. There are reports from outside the Bible, as I said, but the vast majority of our information about Jesus' life comes from the New Testament. Textual criticism works by comparing ancient manuscripts to discover their original wording. So why would we want to do that? If the vast majority of our information about Christ's life comes from the New Testament, we want to know if the New Testament is reliable. We want to know how does it compare in terms of its reliability to other ancient texts that scholars take for granted. So yeah, textual criticism is the science they use. And as I said, it works by comparing ancient manuscripts to discover their original wording. So how this works is you have the original document, and they look for the time gap between the original document and the first copy of it, as well as all the other copies of it, which is demonstrated here. The shorter the time gap, the better, obviously, because it's more likely that the first copy is going to be faithful to the original document. And also the number of copies of early texts. The more numbers of early copies, the better, because you just have more to compare to. So again, the smaller the time gap and the more copies, the better, the more reliable we can say a historical text is. So here is a graph which might look confusing initially, but I'll explain it now. So compare the New Testament, say, to some other historical texts that are never doubted. You've got two ancient historians, Herodotus and Thucydides. These guys both contributed a number of sort of ancient works, and they're studied in classics departments in universities around the world. But the original writing, the gap between their original documents and the sort of earliest manuscripts that we have, is about 1,300 years. So that's an enormous gap between the original writings and the first copies of it. And as you can see there, there's only between 8 to 10 copies of their writings, and yet you can go into most bookshops and you'll find at least one book by either of these guys. And yeah, they're taught authoritatively in universities around the world. So if that's the standard for sort of authoritative ancient texts, we can improve on that, to put it that way. You've got Julius Caesar then, who famously penned the Gallic War. The gap between the original document of the Gallic War and the earliest manuscripts of it is 950 years, and there's only around 10 copies that they've been able to sort of trace back to that point. So again, 950 years and 10 copies. So it's not that, not that fine an art. But again, the Gallic War is read in classics departments. It's commented on. That's how we understand a lot of the history of the period. Then we've got Titus Livius, who was a Roman historian, and his Livy's Roman History is an incredibly famous book. The gap between the original document and the manuscript is 900 years, and there's around 20 copies, so it's better than either of the previous ones, but still not ideal. But then you get to the New Testament, and going by textual criticism anyway, which really is the relied upon science, it blows the others out of the water. So the New Testament was written between 400 and 100 AD, and the earliest manuscripts were written between 130 and 350 AD. So the gap between the original document and the earliest manuscript is somewhere between 30 and 310 years. So it might seem like a bit of a wide gap, but it blows, as I said, all of these other texts that are taken so authoritatively out of the water in terms of its sort of the body of work that it's resting upon. As well as this, we don't just have 8, 10, 20 copies. There's 5,000 doesn't even do it justice. There's over 5,300 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. There's over 10,000 Latin manuscripts of the New Testament from that period, and there's over 9,300 others in various other languages. So in terms of a physical body of evidence from that time, that all say remarkably consistent things, the various writings of the New Testament really do blow other ancient texts out of the water. So in terms of the reliability of the New Testament, in terms of conveying the physical facts of Christ's life from that time, historians don't doubt that too much. Again, a lot of the questions come in when it comes to the miracles and who he said he was, but in terms of historical authenticity, you're not going to get too much argument on that. So to move it on a little bit, who was Jesus? Well, in the New Testament, we got plenty of evidence that he was human at the very least, and as I said, there's an abundance of evidence, as we just saw, that he existed as a person. So obviously he was human. The New Testament itself documents all of the different human aspects of his life. I mean, it well documents his suffering and the passion, his hunger, his mourning, his family life, his work, his love, his friendships, faith, and his hope, his prayer. So just like us, you have pretty much every human dimension. You do have every human dimension represented in Christ's life. And if the New Testament is as historically reliable as we believe it to be, you've got a pretty fully fleshed out person there in Christ for us to refer to when people do come with their questions. But as you saw in some of the things that people say about Christ there, was he more than a leader? Some people think he's just a spiritual teacher. They think he's a wise man who wandered around and taught. What's to differentiate Christ from these other leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, Buddha, Che Guevara? I'm not actually sure who the picture of that last man is that I put in there, but regardless, the answer we give to that is that whereas all of these other great leaders would have said, all of these other great leaders would have said things like, this is the way to the truth. Look at this, do this and you'll be fine. Jesus didn't refer people anywhere other than to himself. He's the only leader, and unless someone can pull me up on this at some point if I'm mistaken, he's the only figure in the world who said, I am the true vine, I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the gate, I am the good shepherd, I am the resurrection and the life, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus didn't point anywhere else when he was trying to lead people. He pointed to himself. He's an indispensable part of what it was he was sharing with people. He's not like Buddha, who showed people the path to transcendence. He's not like Martin Luther King, who led a sort of movement of civil disobedience. He was very much forming a movement around himself, or he was forming a church around himself, as we come to see. But he's absolutely unique amongst the pantheon of world leaders, religious leaders, in that regard. If the New Testament is as reliable as we say it is as well, he's the only one, in his words, who has the power to forgive sins and judge the world. Now, these sayings, as we see in the Bible, they absolutely scandalized the people at the time. You know, it was clear to them that he was claiming that he was God. This is why he was ultimately killed, obviously, but it was also why he had a lot of near misses. I mean, there's a number of occasions where the Jews take up stones to kill him because they fully grasped what he was saying. He wasn't sort of, as we'll get to now in a moment, he wasn't leaving any sort of back doors open. So he said that he was God. That was clear to the Jews, and it was clear to it's sort of clear to us now that that's what he was saying. And C.S. Lewis proposed the famous trilemma, that Jesus was either a lunatic, a liar, or he was what he said he was. He was God. If he said what he didn't believe and it wasn't true, he was a liar. So, if he was saying, I and the Father are one, and he didn't believe it and it wasn't true, Jesus was a liar. So, we've got his words recorded. If he didn't believe what he was saying and it wasn't true, he was a liar. And as a result, he's not a great moral teacher. He would actually be a pretty terrible one. If he said what he did believe and it wasn't true, he was mad. So if Jesus was saying, I and the Father are one, and he really believed it, but it wasn't true, again, not a great person to be following, because he was mad. If he was talking about all of these things that he was going to do and he wasn't capable of doing them, people would have been better off ignoring him. But if he said what he did believe and it was true, that the only possibility that leaves us with is that he's God. He, as C.S. Lewis said, he didn't leave any other options open to us. He said absolutely remarkable things that closed all the other doors but him being God. So we really have to make the choice between those three things: liar, lunatic, and God. And he provided pretty compelling evidence, which, as we've seen, is reliably recorded, that he's God. So is he what he claimed to be then, the Son of God? There's a couple of aspects to this which I'll speed through because I realize I don't have too much time left. His teachings lend pretty decent credence to the idea that he was God. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, Western civilization is very much built upon the Judeo-Christian tradition, but Jesus expressed, as it says, he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. He really communicates God perfectly. He didn't make any mistakes. There have been no moral advancements since Christ spoke. Since he gave his Sermon on the Mount, sorry, in 2,000 years since then, no one has said better than him. Our laws in the Western world are based upon what he said, or at least until recent times, with varying success in different places. But the great human dignity that we've all grown up, we've all taken for granted for so long, those are based on Christ's words. And there's good reason to believe that only divine words could result in that sort of effect. His works and the company he kept. So obviously we have plenty of recording and a reliable source that Jesus performed all sorts of miraculous works. There was a lot of people writing about this at the time, and it's been communicated to us today. So the miracles sort of speak for themselves. He led a miraculous life. He multiplied loaves and fish. He healed people of their lifelong ailments. He transformed people's lives utterly. And the company he kept, he went to the people that no one else wanted to go to. It's an incredibly moving passage when he heals the leper who throws himself on the ground before him because Jesus reaches out and touches him. And yes, it's great that he healed his leprosy, but equally remarkable was the fact that Jesus touched him. No one would have touched this leper in years, however long he was afflicted. to sort of just the ability to overlook what people thought of him, the ability to reach out to the margins and have the effect that it's had for 2,000 years, with the church continuing to reach out to the marginalized people. It truly is a divine legacy to leave. Even amongst people who don't share the Catholic beliefs, his personality has radiated throughout the Western world. Time, the famous US magazine, called Jesus the most persistent symbol of purity, self-denial, and love in the history of Western man. They claimed that he exhibited supreme disinterest but never self-pity, humility but never weakness, joy but never at the expense of others, and goodness but not indulgence. I think it speaks for itself that, you know, people who aren't even Catholic, Time magazine, not being a particularly Catholic source, would list him as such. There've been more songs to Christ, more paintings of Christ, and more books about Christ than anyone else in human history. And they also named him the most significant person of in human history. So he really, arguably, if you Google the most famous person in human existence, Jesus Christ is the top of the list. So you know, you realize now with social media how difficult it is to reach any number of people. I mean, I have access to more of the world than ever at my fingertips, and I still couldn't amass the following that Christ amassed when he was walking around a dusty land with 12 people, 12 apostles, I should say. So it's a pretty remarkable thing. So finally, and I'll just hurry through this, all of this would be for naught if he didn't rise from the dead, as St. Paul said. And there's some pretty compelling evidence for this too. Number one being the body absent from the tomb. There's a couple of, you know, attempted explanations of this, which is that, you know, some people said the authorities stole it. But when Christianity really started to gain momentum, it's totally irrational as to why they wouldn't have produced the body to quickly dispel the rumor that he'd risen from the dead. It doesn't make any sense. At the same time, people have said, you know, thieves broke in, took the body, but that doesn't make any sense either. I mean, the only things of value in the tomb would have been the burial cloths. There's no value in a dead body. Then the New Testament being a reliable source, we have recorded apparitions to the disciples on over 11 occasions and at different times to over 100 people, over 500 people, sorry, it lists. At the same time, so it's pretty harder to believe that 500 people experienced the same hallucination than it is to believe that they really saw something that they couldn't explain. I think the most compelling one actually is the transformation in the disciples. These were, as we see listed in the gospel, they don't paint a flattering picture. They were cowardly, they were stupid at times, they were selfish, they were passionate, willful. And yet, nearly all of the disciples, the apostles, bar John, if I understand correctly, went to violent deaths. They were utterly transformed by their contact with Christ. I mean, I can't convince a single person to do what I want them to do. To convince, as we see here, 2.3 billion people, I realize it's probably a bit of an optimistic number, a lot of people identifying as such but not truly living it, but still there have been hundreds of thousands of martyrs in the history of the church. It's believed at this stage, and the fact that a man 2,000 years ago would be able to convict them to do such a thing is a remarkable legacy. So there's decent evidence to believe that Jesus really rose from the dead, and as St. Paul said, that's a good thing for us, because if he didn't, we'd be in an awkward situation indeed. So that's just, again, there's so much more to this, far more than I can go into now, and there's books written about this. There's so much more you can look into if you're interested in the historicity of Christ and his resurrection. But it's just a little dip into the ocean of some of the points that we have in our favor. As to how it relates to the church, we have it in the Gospel of Matthew, and I'll finish up very quickly now after this. We have it in the Gospel of Matthew that he said to Peter that on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. The church rests on Christ, and we have it in the incredibly reliable New Testament that the church rests upon a pretty reliable historical figure. So there's decent reason to believe that the church is is the place to be if you want to follow this man whom we have so much evidence for. And that's what I've chosen to do. I mean, this has had such an enormous impact on me. I wouldn't have believed in Christ if I'd just been told to, because as I said, I only came back to the faith a couple of years ago, and the church's authority didn't really mean anything to me at that point. It was because I found the evidence quite compelling, and there's far more than could possibly be listed here, as I said. But we really do have a strong base for what we believe, and it's really worth looking into so that we can continue to share it with others. And who knows, you might change someone's life such that they end up giving presentations like this one day. So that's everything from me. And yeah, I hope that was useful to some of you.
That was great. Thanks very much, Jason, for that. You can definitely see that journalistic mindset when you're approaching the evidence there. That's brilliant. Really, really good. Yeah, no, it definitely is that, just that kind of what really struck me anyway was that kind of the thing you said at the very beginning about not taking Christ for granted, because I do think that it is something, I suppose, in Catholic Ireland growing up, that it kind of nearly is something that's caught, not taught. And I suppose going along those lines as well, if anyone is interested in kind of furthering that kind of train of thought, there's actually a kind of Aquinas week happening from the 18th to the 24th of July, and they'll kind of go in further in depth in those questions that you were probing there, and